Well, thank you very much, everybody. We're here, well, I think we've given an overview, but we're here to really talk about this kind of unfulfilled potential. So, you know, RegTech really does provide, or it gives the regulators an opportunity to really, fulfill some of the objectives in association with compliance. But what we've seen actually is that adoption hasn't really kept pace with all of those expectations. Now, I think a lot of the people in this room and attending the conference today are in the world of RegTech. They're in the business of trying to address a lot of the regulatory concerns that the market has, and the regulators are conveying into the market through the adoption of technology. So we're here today to talk about, one, what is that? How can we address that unfulfilled potential? But also, how can we, with the application of RegTech, manage and hopefully over time drive down that ever-growing cost of compliance? So I've got a really good panel of speakers with me today. I'll let them introduce themselves in a moment, but we've got a good mix, I think, of both organizations that work really globally and internationally with lots of institutions around the world, as well as people that are really kind of engaging in the local market. So maybe if we just go across, start with Sian.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sian Lewin. Among other things, I chaired the RegTech platform working group that devised the RegTech test, and I'm sure we'll learn a little bit more about that this afternoon.
Hi everyone, Blanchard. I'm Business Development Director for TSO, which effectively provides RegTech solutions for regulators, among which are editorial platforms for drafting regulations, as well as a publishing platform for distribution of those regulations, and hopefully we'll see that as a pathway to machine-readable rules as well.
I'm Lloyd. I'm Global Policy Director at Onfido, and we are an ID verification company providing AI-driven ID verification solutions predominantly for the financial services sector in order to fulfill their AML, KYC compliance regimes and obligations.
Hi, I'm Corinna Mitchell from Symphony. Symphony is a communications platform. We provide pipes and rails for some of the largest banks and asset managers around the world. So our customer base is specialized but very, very global.
Hi, I'm Doyle. I'm CEO of NorthRow. We are an AML, KYC business, software business.
Brilliant, thank you. So as Sian said at the start, so a working group came together, gosh, probably about a year ago, with a mix of, you know, kind of financial institutions, professional services, organizations, and RegTech vendors themselves to really, and working with the City of London and Innovate Finance to author a paper around what the market thinks the regulator should do to drive the adoption of RegTech more broadly in the market. So as the chair of that working group, it would be good to get a bit of an overview of what is this thing called a RegTech test, and how do you really think it could have an impact on the adoption of RegTech in the UK?
Sure. So the RegTech test was actually the idea of the policy team at Innovate Finance. They included it in a response to an HMT consultation around the future of financial services regulation. We took that idea as a working group and we ran with it. And I think one of the things that we identified was that within regulators, RegTech is often in the domain of the fantastic innovation teams that exist within the regulators, but we don't hear much about it from the policy teams, the supervisory teams, the enforcement teams. Like all organizations, regulators also have the silo effect. So we felt that actually if we start at the beginning of the rulemaking and regulation process, which is the drafting and consultation around new and amended regulatory rules, and weave in how RegTech could be considered at the very beginning of the regulatory process, that would be a catalyst and an impetus for the understanding of RegTech to spread more through the regulators, but also encourage that dialogue a lot earlier on in the implementation process. So we came up with this idea of the RegTech test. It includes 5 recommendations for things that the PRA and the FCA could do to help include RegTech and compliance technology more broadly. So RegTech isn't just third-party vendors. A lot of financial institutions build their own technology for compliance. How policymakers could consider that as they're drafting and consulting on rules. So we recommended, like regulators have to consider smaller businesses in their drafting of regulation. Could they do an impact assessment on compliance technology simply by asking a question in the consultation paper? How are these new or amended rules likely to impact your existing compliance technology stack? Are there novel and innovative solutions on the market that could help comply with this new regulation? And are there any existing standards, data standards, for example, or regulatory reporting standards that could be used rather than creating something new? So that's the essence, really, of the RegTech test. There are some other recommendations in there, a policy working group, including representatives from the RegTech industry, potentially policy tech sprints, a policy sandbox, all sorts of ideas that we've put to the regulators. And really, we see this as not just helping firms and RegTech vendors, but also helping regulators themselves meet their objectives, particularly around the secondary competition objective. RegTech is an enabler for the growth of the financial services industry, and that's something that the regulators are now taking very seriously, given their secondary regulatory obligation. The other aspect is the cost of compliance. We know the burden of compliance is rising, the cost of compliance is rising, and ultimately that's likely to be passed on to consumers, which isn't an outcome that anybody wants in the industry. So anything that can be done to reduce the cost of compliance whilst keeping financial markets safe, protecting consumers, protecting investors, we think is a good thing.
Excellent, thank you. And we're going to have a question later on, actually, to kind of get some real-life examples of what it means in terms of the cost of compliance and how RegTech can have a really positive impact on that. But before we go there, how do we drive innovation within these big institutions and within the market? And how can a RegTech test of this kind, or more guidance from the regulator, really help to drive innovation? So if I just go to Alan on this. You're in the business of kind of bringing these policies to life for organizations. So can this kind of RegTech test really drive and improve innovation within the market?
Yes, it can. And I think at the moment we have quite a gap when it comes to adoption. But certainly better policy making starts with the sort of RegTech for regulators space, because there are definitely massive challenges when you're trying to pass a policy over to the legal drafting team, for example, within the regulator. For that drafter to give effect to that policy is a bit of a, the danger is you're going to have some unintended consequences of potentially doing some drafting work that you think is doing the job. So if you can digitize the rules, you can then start doing digital twin versions of handbooks and things like this, and start producing policy, start giving effect to policy really in the way that it was intended to in the first place. So there's sort of, from the regulator side, you sort of improve the rules themselves. And then on the sort of firm side, if they have access to a digital rule book, this removes the need for horizon scanning, putting everything in a spreadsheet, obligation mapping, implementing it in policies and controls. You can start to connect much more closely your sort of compliance toolkit, that's your regulation management system in-house or whatever, but you can start plugging that directly into the regulator's rule book. You can then see the impact of those regulatory changes immediately, and you don't have to worry too much about what's coming down the chute. Obviously, you have to worry about it a little bit, but then you can start doing much more in terms of product development, better things for your customers. The consumer benefit is quite clear when firms are acting in an area where it's much more certain what they're dealing with.
So getting rid of horizon scanning and the mapping of obligations to controls, it sounds like you're trying to get rid of professional services firms right there.
Not at all, no. Not at all. No, because that's not really a super valuable job. The valuable job is in designing the products that best fit the market and give the best outcomes for consumers. Filling in a spreadsheet of what the rule says and then trying to figure out, whether that needs to be implemented or not isn't super valuable.
No, thank you. Same question, but it's worth, I think, thinking about it from a global context. So, we're very focused on the UK, and the RegTech test was obviously pointed at the PRA and the FCA. But what about other global regulators and how we see guidance coming from more global regulators having an impact or a positive impact on the adoption of RegTech? And that one's to Corinna, because obviously Symphony is a big global organization that works with institutions all over the world. So it'd be really good to get your view and insight on that.
So it's interesting. We also have a lot of customers in the US and look at US regulation a lot. And just to note, for example, some of the regulators there, when they're putting forth draft regulations, they have to have an impact assessment as to what they think the cost, for example, and the benefits and disbenefits of a new regulation are. So it would be easy to include something like, is the technology there, or what would be the savings from technology for these regulations? That's the first point, which is an interesting way of doing it, and I think a good one. The second is that as a global firm with global customers, for us having very different regulations in different jurisdictions is incredibly awkward, much more expensive and difficult to comply with for ourselves and our customers. So what we tend to see is that different regulators will take the lead in different initiatives, and we will tend to follow that first mover, and then the other regulators might follow along, but we have to comply with one standard because we can't have multiple different products. We have only one data privacy framework. That's just one. We can't have multiple. Another thing that we look at, for example, is we're building integrations to help solve T+1 settlement in the US for securities, which is coming in May. So we've got integrations to help our customers adopt. We know that Europe and the UK are very seriously looking at adopting the same in a few years' time, because once the US securities market has gone to T+1, the rest of the markets, which are so interrelated, are going to de facto need to follow. So there's a lot of interesting trends around global regulation. For us, having as much consistency as possible is really important. I do think that having that dialogue with regulators and them taking into account, is the technology there? Can the technology help the regulated entities get there, is incredibly important, and it's something that we've seen.
And does this, and we'll come on to the cost question in a moment, but before we get there, this means that once we've kind of solved, and I, inverted commas solved, because obviously local regulation in different jurisdictions is going to be nuanced. It means, though, that we can almost kind of rinse and repeat around the world.
That is the idea, and of course that drives consistency and efficiency and cost savings, because it is, there's no doubt, every new regulation is an additional cost for those that are regulated to implement. And if you can have it consistent as possible, even with a few variations, of course you need them, that is so important. And it helps drive innovation, because if you're a smaller provider like ourselves, we're not giant, we couldn't possibly provide a tailored product for every jurisdiction. We just won't be able to go there. And so if you don't have some element of consistency, you won't get that same level of innovation, because only the most massive providers will actually be able to tailor something from a jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So that's another perspective on that.
Thank you. And going back to then that cost of compliance. So if we try and bring it to life for the audience and the people that are watching, we talk about the ever-growing compliance burden, and obviously with that comes a not unsubstantial cost to organizations, and that's not going away. That's at the moment getting bigger and bigger and bigger, normally because it's driven by hands and feet, that people, headcount costs that need to do things. So how can RegTech be used to address some of these cost concerns? So maybe we can start with Alid, just in terms of working with your client base. How have you been able to kind of address some of that cost challenge?
So I think it relies very heavily on sort of understanding what each product involves and what it is that our customers are actually buying from us, right? So they're buying an IDV solution, and that's part of being compliant with their KYC AML obligations. But that also, if they are a global or at least interregional provider of services, is going to require compliance in multiple jurisdictions. And to understand how that compliance works with the product itself, you need an intimate knowledge of the technical workings, ultimately, of that product. How is it processing data? How is it structured, etc. So what you tend to find is that there is such a specialized requirement at this point in terms of both the technology. So the IDV process is just one stage of that end-to-end AML KYC journey that's required. The intimate knowledge of the product and how that works and how that interacts with the regulation and how it interacts with different regulation in different jurisdictions, etc., is an enormous amount of work in and of itself, in addition to all of the challenges of simply understanding the regulations as they stand alone, as Corinna has mentioned. Therefore, the cost of compliance really is reduced fundamentally just in that first stage, because what you do is when you're coming to market, when you're choosing which product you're going to use to meet your AML requirements, you're going to look at it in terms of how it complies, and you're going to buy it off the shelf in the same way that you buy a car and you assume that every part of that car meets with the compliance and the regulations and the technical standards, etc. And so you are saving yourself in that instance alone a significant challenge, both in terms of the development, the adjustment of the product, and the understanding of how it fits in the ecosystem. You're also looking at then the wider environment of regulations around that. So not just looking at IDV as part of a KYC requirement. You're looking at it in terms of a platform that is processing biometric data and the data protection concerns around that. You're looking at it as a system that is using AI and the forthcoming regulatory burdens around AI that are associated with that solution. And so very quickly, what you see is that for these specialized pieces of the sort of RegTech ecosystem that are required by the financial institution in the first instance, they are not only solving the direct problem, but also the broader ecosystem and challenges of problems that if you were to do them in-house would add significant costs. And as has previously been mentioned on the panel, the ability to actually perform this function in-house is simply prohibitive. And therefore, yeah, huge savings possible.
And just keeping pace as well with developments, right? I think, so it means we don't have to have a huge potential team who are just crawling all over, building new technology so they can address some of these regulatory concerns. But what about, and continuing on with the broader fin crime theme, which actually, having worked, and I've worked around the world in different jurisdictions, one of the common kind of investment areas that I've certainly seen in the RegTech space is broadly around fin crime. And there's a tremendous amount of investment, and there continues to be a big focus. But how about working with these big global institutions? And so the globalization of some of these platforms and products, but also dealing with this regulatory divergence, and how can RegTech, ideally address some of those concerns? So if we go to Andrew to talk about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the regulatory burden increases all the time. And each country has slightly different regulation. And it's very difficult for financial institutions that are trying to deliver service there and meet all the regulations that are in place. At the very bottom of this is the customer, and they're there to be protected. And that's what the regulation's about. So any company that's trying to do business internationally is actually working in small local markets. It's not one thing fits everything across the whole of the world. And so they have to think about if I'm regulated in the UK or if I'm regulated in Germany. There is fine differences, and the regulator has a different focus in the UK than they may have in Germany, where data privacy is probably the greater focal point. But in terms of crime, you're trying to stop bad actors getting into the system and spotting bad actors. And if you fail to do that, the risk to your business is quite huge. It's not only financial risk, which obviously is, as we were talking about earlier, is the stick. But there's also reputational damage. And it would always make it more difficult for you if you're trying to get into a new market and you have a so-called black mark against you. Sorry, yeah, you were going to say something.
No, I was going to say, and so how can a single RegTech platform then, specifically focused on that kind of problem statement, really help to address some of this kind of multi-jurisdictional challenge, certainly when in relation to cost?
Yeah, it's almost you're setting me up with that question, because it comes down to rules-based. So you really need to have a system that can accommodate the local regulation. And we were talking earlier about AI. You can use AI to feed into your solution, your platform, what the local regulation is. You set your risk, your threshold of risk according to the regulation. Get it wrong, and it's a challenge. But if you have that flexibility, and if you can take advice, internally normally is the best place to get advice from an MLRO or something like that, who should understand what the local risk is. But all vendors will provide some level of advice. But ultimately, the risk ends up with the company that's...
Exactly, and I think we've talked to, across the panel as well around having that degree of consistency of understanding so that we can then build it into the technology, whether or not it's interpretation of policy, whether or not we're looking at kind of ID and V, whether or not we're talking about broader communications and plugging lots of different organizations together, or if that broader fin crime stuff. So, it's a really interesting one. We've got a couple of minutes left in the panel. My last question will go in turn, going really back to kind of the focus of kind of the overall brief around the level of adoption of RegTech in the UK. If you could wish for one thing that the regulator could do to drive the adoption of RegTech in the UK, what would it be? And we'll just go down the road, Sian.
I've got a very easy answer to this. They should implement the RegTech test.
Well, my appeal would be to all regulators, not just financial service regulators, but they need to stop producing PDFs, stop locking up their information away in PDFs stuck on a website somewhere. Let's set the standard for the whole industry, and let's set it much more digital first.
I would say what we want as well is to see regulators providing the advice that regulated institutions need to be intelligent customers of RegTech, to know what it is that they're looking for in order to encourage them and make it easier for them to find the services that can help them be compliant.
Well, James, I think you've posed yourself as the regulatory genie and asked us each to, you're granting us a wish. My wish would be that we have more coordination for regulation globally.
I wouldn't argue with that. I would love that. But I would also like the regulators over here to set very clear framework that is, and we talked about that earlier, which is certification, which they're not going to do, but at least a test so that every company that's trying to buy from a vendor can measure off and tick, yes, that meets all the boxes, and I'm comfortable with my decision.
Can I have one extra
Please.
wish? I'm greedy. And this is something that people don't necessarily think about, but a lot of the financial institutions have pretty old tech at their backbone, really legacy tech. And it would be to the regulators to encourage interoperability for all new tech so that it can all at least try and talk to itself and share information and make it much more future forward.
I think that should be the topic of a future panel for sure. Look, thank you very much. We are on time. I'd like to thank my panelists. Could we give the panelists a round of applause, please? Thank you very much.